Friends, I've been a humanitarian worker now for 40 years. In this period, I've seen a lot change to the better. There are more affluent people, more rich people around the world now than at any time before in global history. But I am also now more worried for more communities in more places than at any time before in these 4 long decades. There are more than 50 armed conflicts with no end in sight. We are now faced with a global climate crisis, and there are more families giving up hope where they are in disaster zones and conflict areas and migrating north. So humanitarian aid is there to help these people. But politics is coming in our way. And one of the reasons is that too many leaders now, my age and older, are instead of saying we want to make humanity great again, we want to save the world population together, they say, I'd like to make my country great again. Their definition of greatness is building walls against refugees and people who come, and in saying, I don't want to be part of fighting global climate change. That should be something others should do. Now and then there are political leaders, and I've seen many of them, who have one aim and one aim only, and that is their own political survival. So when I was the United Nations aid chief, I had to go to Zimbabwe. It was 2005, and the population there was in socioeconomic free fall. I could see that when I arrived. At this time, Mugabe was planning to print, and he was the strongman. President Mugabe was the strongman of Zimbabwe, and he was trying to fight this problem by printing a $100 trillion bill. It could hardly buy a loaf of bread for the hungry. And then on top of that, 700,000 people had been made homeless by a cruel campaign to relocate people. I met them. They were out in the open. It was miserable. They were suffering. So I went to President Mugabe and I said, we need to give them tents. I'm willing to provide tents from the United Nations. And he said, I don't want tents. Tents are for Arabs. His concern, however, was, I don't want to look bad to the world. I don't want my crisis, the one I made, to become an international embarrassment for me. Now, Mugabe is thankfully gone, but this problem of political or military leaders blocking access for humanitarian workers like me, when we try to help the vulnerable and the innocent, is becoming bigger. We're being blocked from Syria to Myanmar by these politicians, by these military leaders. And then there is neglect. So my organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, has done a survey. We looked at how many people were suffering and being displaced in each of these crises, and then how much or how little political will there was to solve the crisis, how much or how little media attention there was to the crisis, and how much money was provided to provide for the needy. Now, this is the list. Cameroon tops it. Many of the countries are in Africa. And this is how much proportionally we asked for in terms of relief for the people there to save lives. This is how much we got for each crisis. Now, you see Cameroon tops the list. I don't know how many people here know that there is a horrific war in 2 places in Cameroon, that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have fled homes that are being torched, villages razed to the ground. I think few people have heard about the crisis in Cameroon, and I don't blame you, because nobody seems to care about the crisis in Cameroon. I went there myself just a few weeks back. I met women and children who had fled for their lives, lived in the open in the bush, and now getting some relief from us. They felt forgotten, they felt neglected, and they are right. Because the world is constructed in a way where some crises are seen as strategic to us, important to us, and therefore they get all of the attention. And then other places, mostly in Africa, but also elsewhere, are actively and systematically ignored. 3 themes that I think also proves how politics is poisoning foreign assistance. First, let's look at the claim coming from politicians that taxpayers spend such an enormous amount of money on aid. Well, Americans were led to believe, and we have seen a survey of that, they were led to believe that 26%, a quarter of all federal spending, was for foreign assistance, more than Social Security, more than healthcare in America. The reality is that 0.2% is given to foreign assistance. And the US is not less generous than the average rich country. They are an average country in this. So, I don't think spending 99.7 or 8% on yourself, you're overwhelmed by foreign assistance. In America, again, foreign aid spending is less than what every American spends on candy compared to your share of foreign aid, or on sports goods, or on jewelry. One more image, perhaps. When we asked, all of the aid organizations asked last year for $25 billion to help all the people in need all over the world, it was $25 billion. How much is that? Well, it is exactly half of the value of ice cream consumption in the world. We asked for half of that, and we got that reduced by another half. And then there is the question of who gives to what? What decides who become our donors? Again, politics. Let's take Yemen as an example. In Yemen, we have now the biggest humanitarian crisis on earth. More than 10 million people are one step from horrific famine in Yemen. And it's all made by this war, senseless war, that men with guns and power wage in Yemen, and women and children bleed and they starve. So, we asked for $3 billion as United Nations and other organizations. And who gave us that money? Well, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were among the top 3 donors. What's special with this case is that they're also the 2 that do most of the bombing of Yemen. So, And this bombing causes suffering, civilian casualties all the time. So I don't think really a UN member state should be both arsonist and firefighter. Now then, let's look at another myth that I'm sure you've heard. Western governments claim that their countries are overwhelmed with refugees. Well, the reality is that European countries, the last 2 years, have hardly received, most of them, hardly received asylum seekers and refugees. 200,000 new asylum seekers in all of the 28 EU member states, for example. And then one would say, would ask or pose that, wasn't there a tremendous refugee crisis in 2015 when 1 million people crossed the Mediterranean and came here to Europe? True, there was 1 million people fleeing war in Syria and elsewhere. So again, how much is that really in Europe? Well, 1 million has to be compared with a population of 741 million on the continent. Another image, if you like. A refugee girl comes in to a schoolyard with 748 other pupils. Are they overwhelmed by the one? I don't think they are. So Europeans have forgotten, we Europeans have forgotten really, we were refugees. And leading this race to the bottom, in my view, are some of the Eastern European governments. For example, Hungary. This is the welcome wall that meets a family fleeing war in Syria, for example. I remember when the Hungarians were refugees. So were the Czechs, so were the Poles, because they were really fleeing from horrific communist oppression in Eastern Europe. And some came to Norway, some even came here to Stavanger, which was my hometown at the time. They played in the symphony orchestra here. They did very well. They were welcomed. Too bad the Hungarian government and the other Eastern European governments have forgotten this. And then a third issue that is of growing concern for us, where politics interfere with our work, is that governments claim that all anti-terrorism laws are protecting victims of terror. And certainly some do. They make us more safe. Terror is a horrific threat in our time. But I'm also telling you, for us as aid workers who work where terror is at its worst, which are the war zones where these so-called terrorist organizations are the strongest, it's become more difficult to help the victims of terror. Women, children, elderly, people suffering in these areas. We did a study in Nigeria where there is a group called Boko Haram. Not only does the government make it impossible to move into areas and help people with food and water and shelter in the areas where they are active, this group, donors make it so restrictive, difficult, dangerous, risky for us to receive their money in these areas that many organizations do not want to venture there. In Idlib, in Syria, there are 3 million civilians now, and some very nasty groups in control. In Gaza, Hamas is in control. Now, donor governments, at least some of them, call these terrorist organizations. There are, however, many more babies that we want to help than extremist men with beard. And when it becomes difficult to aid the children, they, the real victims of terror, are struck twice. And speaking of children, I was recently here in northern Cameroon, and I met these children in a schoolyard. Were helping with education in this area. So I remember it was very hot, 42 degrees Celsius when I come there. They, however, were enthusiastic because I asked them, as I always do when I come to a school, what do you want to become, children, when you get as old as me? And they had dreams. They wanted to become doctors, nurses, engineers, football players, farmers. None of them wanted to seek revenge against those who had attacked their village, who had made them displaced. None of them wanted to continue the senseless war in this area. They wanted to build their society. They wanted to build Cameroon. They didn't want to go to Europe. So they have dreams, and here we come in, because we can realize their dreams. They can still become doctors and teachers. But then politics cannot prevent us from helping them, and politics cannot make us invest everything of our enormous wealth at home. We need to provide some solidarity and some compassion. So, what do we do? Not easy to act in this complicated world of ours, but there are a few things we can do, all of us. First is read up. We live in a world where too few issues are really focused on. Read up on the forgotten emergencies, on where the suffering is the greatest, on where the potential for creating hope is the biggest. Find out who's behind the oppression, who's behind the bombing, who's supporting those who make people refugees. And then speak up. We all have a voice. We can talk, we can argue, we can seek the floor and say, I'd like to propose solidarity, compassion, that we help. On the internet, we can meet this tsunami of hateful rhetoric against minorities, against refugees. We can speak up when we hear about people, maybe even in our own community, who speak badly about refugees that they have never, ever seen or met. And then we can stand up. We can vote in elections. We can vote for international support, solidarity, for hope for the children in Cameroon. We can use our resources to fight global climate change, to fight for compassion internationally, to solve international problems. We can make leadership great again, and we can make humanity great again. Thank you very much.